Hi, the following episode is the pilot of the podcast Dissonance Makes Sense. The episode contains a conversation that addresses the topic of belonging. In the process, we share some anecdotes about anxiety, self-acceptance, and vulnerability. In between, we also look at some illustrations by researchers like Brené and Abraham Maslow. All these aspects play into the question of belonging and why it has such an impact on us treating ourselves and others. I hope you will enjoy this first and for now only episode before I can dig into the material more in summer. If you would like to know more about what the podcast will be about, you will find some more information on the website dissonance-makes-sense.net. There you will also find some update regarding social media presence. My name is Elisa. I'm the founder of this podcast, and I hope you will enjoy the following conversation. See ya. Before we go into anything like regarding the topic, I would ask you to just introduce yourself a little bit.
My name's Karl Johnson. I write and founded the blog. It's called belonging.blog, but informally the title's just Belonging. And I'm an interracial adoptee. I was born in South Korea and then adopted into the United States when I was a baby. I'm also a social worker. Actually, I just got a new job working with foster parents, doing caregiver support for foster parents and foster families. So I'm super excited about that. Also kind of in the same vein as belonging and how do we talk about and cultivate belonging. But yeah, I'm super happy to be here, and it's kind of a interesting magic of the internet that we cross paths.
Congrats on your new job. I think that sounds so exciting. I mean, we talked the first time like in November or December maybe. And I think, and you mentioned that you're looking for a new job. Now with like this new job, which you have like a connection with and understanding, I imagine that is very interesting and very interesting field.
Yeah.
So
I'm pretty excited.
And I also read one thing on your page, on your About page. You wrote, I am a narrative, I'm still writing. What does it mean to you, like being a narrative you're writing or still writing?
Yeah, I think sometimes it is a little bit heavy, and sometimes it can get a little bit heady as well. But I think all the parts of my story very much so play a part of who I am, and I think it's sort of a nod to just living intentionally about who I am and sort of who I'm becoming. I know it sounds like super cheesy.
Not at all.
But it's definitely true. I just think living presently takes a lot of introspection about where you've been and who you are, and who you want to be. Pulls from who you are now, and who you were. And so I don't know. That's kind of like the headspace that I get into when I write for my blog, I guess. So.
That's amazing. And I think it doesn't sound cheesy at all, because, I mean, since you mentioned like the main topic or like the headline of your blog is belonging. And I think since that is something so emotional and so close to the heart, I think there's nothing cheesy about it, because I mean, there's nothing that gets cheesier than emotions and speaking from the heart and everything.
True.
And so, well, so I don't mind cheesiness, and I really appreciate the honesty and the openness you have with while talking about everything about your life and what you're doing now, how it influences your thoughts, influence your daily basis in a way. But we mentioned now like a few times like what the topic is, and that is like belonging, like the name of your blog. And when we talked about the outline, you had a very nice first title in a way for the first part in a way that was like understanding belonging. Is it a place or is it a feeling? Yeah. what does that mean to you, like when you think about it, if it's a feeling or if it's a place? Why those two parts in a way?
Yeah, I feel like people always talk about the saying like home is where the heart is, or sometimes you hear people talk about like you belong with a people or you belong with a certain person and not necessarily at a place. And so I feel like just in general, culturally or interpersonally, the definition of belonging is not exactly talked about, but everyone kind of knows what it is. Um, so I guess for me, that's sort of how I have encountered it. I don't know about you. Is there like a colloquial, saying for it in like German, or do people talk about like home and that idea?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know. I think that is super like individual. And I think when we talked the first time, we talked also about like a little bit about group identity or national identity and so on. And I feel like when it comes to those things, especially when it comes to the word of home, we have different words for it, like being at home, like literally in the house, having a home, or like home in the sense of where you come from, or
Right.
what you like feel like is your home in the sense of a region or country or city or whatever. So there has been actually a long discussion about what does home mean in a way. But for me personally, when it comes to belonging and also home in that sense, it's like having a space that could be an emotional space or like space in between like a group where I don't have to fear rejection.
Yeah.
And I thought that yeah, I don't know. I feel like when I thought about it, I felt like, okay, that tells a lot about myself. If like, for me, it's like, okay, I belong somewhere as long as I'm wanted and I'm not left out of the group. So, but yeah, you sent me also a link of Brené Brown, who was talking about that, like the difference between belonging and fitting in. How did you get to Brené Brown and that context?
Yeah, Brené Brown's great. She's a social worker and she's a researcher who studies like resiliency and vulnerability and like grief. Um, and so she's written like a few books and she's got a lot of talks on YouTube. Fantastic researcher and content. And I think the biggest distinction she makes, and even like when you talk about how do I find a place that I don't have the fear of being rejected, how do I find a place that is like really accepting of me? Like we can still attribute both these sides, fitting in and belonging, to like both of those kinds of places. Fitting in is more about everybody else and about changing yourself and acclimating to people's expectation or like something that they think you should be already. So you really want to fit in. You're gonna buy new clothes. You're gonna listen to a different kind of music so that you can fit into what these people think is cool or what they want you to be. And then belonging is way more like internal and intrinsic of like again, like this sounds really cheesy, but it's really true of like your true self and your whole self. And when you are in tune with that, you reflect and you bring that wherever you go. And then it's much less about, am I doing something right for these people, and more of like is what I'm bringing right for this group, or something like that. And so, which when people talk about home, like a lot of times you might find like your home and the people around you and where you've kind of grown up is just like you've just been acclimating to what you should do for your whole life. And so I guess in that sense, like belonging just is like a journey to your true self sort of thing. Which, getting back to like my narrative piece in the beginning, that's kind of like the idea behind that too. And I think when we first talked, you have mentioned that about growing up and being in school and sort of how you like felt a certain way, or you were like othered, and then how that changed, how your perception of it and of the world changed when you got older, and sort of out of that environment. I think you had mentioned that too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like for the context, so what I told you about my experience at school was regarding my physical disability, and when I got into a school where I got kind of like the official state of being a so-called integration child, I got like othered in that way, like, okay, and you are belonging to the group of the othered, the integration children.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was then there were the normal children, the children without any disabilities or whatever. And so they tried to create a belonging to one group. I didn't sign up for myself. I felt back then like I didn't belong to the rest of the group, like in the class, because I was put into a group I didn't decide to be in. So I didn't feel like fitting in either of these groups. So I think that's why I had this big wish for like belonging to the others and trying to literally fitting in. What can I do? What can I say? How can I behave in a way that people like me? And at some point for me, it was more like I overdid it. I tried to be super extroverted and I talked a lot. And then people thought I was annoying because I was talking so much or I was loud. So it was a vicious circle of never really fitting in.
Yeah.
So this approach of like belonging is being true to yourself and speaking your own truth. I think that is what Brené Brown says as well. That is kind of like really close connected to the self-actualization you mentioned as well before, which is part of the Maslow hierarchy. Do you mind kind of like explaining that quickly, like the stages?
Yeah, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is just like it's used in like in psych and just as like a really useful tool, and it's like shaped like a pyramid, and it goes up from like your most basic needs of like physical safety and food and water, all the way up through like like self-esteem, and like the very top is it's called self-actualization, and there's been like tons of research done on self-actualization, and sort of it's maybe a combination of like executive state and executive functioning and of like healthy self-image and self-esteem, and like everything like goes into all of it, into the top. And like if you don't have like something underneath it, right, then people say like it's impossible or very hard to achieve self-actualization. If someone doesn't have food, obviously they can't function, and they're not going to be able to like sit and think about, am I bringing my true self into the world? Like you need food, so like their priority is their baseline needs, and so yeah, I something that I had really thought about is like belonging and self-actualization are like really tied pretty close together, because what I like most, I guess, is that like Maslow's hierarchy of needs is just about you and your needs. Am I getting food? Am I getting water? Am I having healthy relationships? How is my self-esteem and my self-image? Like that has nothing to do with other people. That's like a check-in of like your needs. And if you don't have what you need, then you're not going to achieve self-actualization. You're not going to be able to be who you are meant to be or be who you want to be. And so, just like what we've been talking about with true self, and sort of finding a place where you belong, I just saw a lot of similarities between how people talked about self-actualization in Maslow's and belonging.
Yeah.
It's sort of like a very holistic way of like thinking about yourself, which I appreciate. Yeah.
Yeah. What I stumbled upon when I read about Maslow's hierarchy was that I thought, okay, is it kind of like required to have the feeling of love and belonging in order to get to self-actualization? Because if so, does that mean that everybody who doesn't get the amazing experience of being loved and belonging, because that not for everybody it's like completely internal. For some people, they have just the desire to belong to friends, family, a social group of any kind, and or having intimacy and all those things. And like sometimes, because it can be such a also like physical like getting hugs and everything is such a like physical experience, that it also kind of prevents us to get into this like mental state of like self-awareness and thinking about your own potential and so on. So I thought, the people who don't experience the love and belonging in that like way, are they doomed to never reach their full potential? Or, because that I sometimes saw as well, can we jump over the love and belonging or the wish for it and kind of focus on ourselves and our own potential, our values and needs in that sense? Is it possible to kind of jump over that third stage to get to the fourth and fifth?
I think obviously like it's really nuanced, because intimacy and connection looks so different between different people, but I mean humans are hardwired for connection. Like we need other people to relate to. We need ways that we can bond with other people. Physical and emotional intimacy is extremely important. And I know sometimes with tools like this of like almost of it, the nature of it being like procedural, of like you need A to have B and you need B to have C. And I know sometimes that's like not a perfect or like accurate representation of things, but I think with the hierarchy of needs, I don't know. I do think, I think people need intimacy and love in order to be able to access different parts of themselves. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about, again, because everyone experiences those things differently. But I just think because of how much humans need connection, that is deep and vulnerable, I think it's like absolutely necessary to have that third. I don't know, if those of you aren't familiar, like love and belonging is like the third little stage of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then after that is esteem, and then self-actualization. And so, I don't know, I think obviously you can't look at it in an extreme and be like, there's a person who hasn't, they spend their time all alone and they are at the period, or they're at the time of self-actualization. But like, that's such an extreme, and I also think that that's not necessarily a good
Absolutely.
Indicator,
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I thought also, like, I mean, we talk a lot about self-love and being in peace with yourself and so on. So I think that is also a big part of the third stage of like, experiencing love towards yourself. Don't other yourself or getting into some kind of self-hatred and so on. Because if you struggle with that, it's difficult to kind of like, getting into like self-esteem and respecting yourself and living up to your values and getting then to your highest potential. So I think also that is, as you said, like it's overlapping. It's not like a closed stage. I think it depends how it resonates with your current life. We talked last time about like sometimes we are so much in our head and people tell us like, oh, you're so self-reflective and you are aware of those things. Yeah, sometimes I don't want to, because sometimes I want to have it simple, please.
Right.
So I thought, like, especially this being in your head, I think that prevents us sometimes also to get into, especially like esteem and that. Where do you see like the connection between vulnerability, because you mentioned it a few times now, and belonging? Like, how necessary is it for us to experience belonging, to be vulnerable?
Yeah, I think kind of vulnerability is always a little bit hard to talk about, and also like it's really hard to be vulnerable a lot. But I think when you're talking about sort of stripping down the layers, when you are like thinking about yourself, and when you're talking about making room, making space for other people, vulnerability is really important, because when you get to things like, I think, even like what you were talking about, like growing up as a kid, like when you get to things that you fear, when you get to things that, the ugly parts inside yourself, maybe not ugly, I guess that's not a good word to describe it, but when you get to the things like fear and rejection and loneliness, sometimes it's like you really don't want to talk about that, or nobody wants to think about that, and when you get to that point, you have to be vulnerable to welcome that and say, that is like a part of who I am. Like I do have this grief, and I do have this, I know that loneliness and isolation is like a huge issue, and also different cultures today. And so when you get to those points of like, I have this crippling loneliness and I have to think about it in order to get over it. Like, who wants to sit there and think about being lonely? Like, nobody wants to do that. That's horrible. But it is important to be vulnerable with yourself, and to like, there's so many different processes that people have, and with their own emotions, of like, how are you accepting that? How are you moving on? How are you, breaking that down? And so like, yeah, for me, like one of my really big insecurities growing up was also like not fitting in, because like I was the only Asian kid in an all-white school, and my identity and who I was, like I was so angry, and I had a lot of resentment, and I had a lot of fear surrounding my adoption and my biological family. And I think especially coming in to like my later teenage years and early adulthood, if I wasn't vulnerable to myself, to like let myself get into that space of like, okay, like I do fear that like I am completely like unwanted, because like my birth family, like I wasn't wanted as a baby, and like all these events when I was a kid, like whatever, like maybe I feel like nobody wants me, or I have like abandonment issues, or I'm really angry at like my Korean parents, or I'm really angry with my adoptive parents. Like if I wasn't vulnerable to those things, like I wouldn't have been able to work through it. I would never have been able to like talk about it with like a therapist. I never would have been able to share a story with somebody else. And like that goes to meeting other people as well, like other adoptees, of like, if I wasn't able to be vulnerable with myself, I wouldn't be able to have that conversation with someone else, to talk about like, how do you feel about your adoption? How do you feel about your birth parents? Like how do you feel about dealing with like the intense rejection and like that kind of stuff? And so I think being vulnerable and sort of like finding out where you belong, or finding your own belonging, I think it's like absolutely necessary, because just as like humans, like we have like all sorts of things that we need to like work on and find out about ourselves and find out about others. And I think that's where a lot stronger and a lot more deep connection happens. So yeah, I just think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think first of all, thank you for kind of like sharing again, like your emotional world there, and what that means to be vulnerable and being here right now, vulnerable and sharing that. I think that is something you really express very well also on your blog, and I think that is something where I thought like, okay, this person is really open and really is not just like self-reflective, but it's really like going into a conversation. You really go into a conversation with yourself in a way, like it feels like also the way you talk about it's like you experience the anger and you had to kind of like go through that because of your experience, your birth parents and everything else, and like how you end up then talking with a therapist about it and everything. I think that is like it in my eyes, it also shows a lot of strength, because like being willing to go into this vulnerability to kind of like on purpose go into like this spot of your own fears and anger. You mentioned before like the ugliness. It's not like the ugliness, but like, it's like we all have those kind of like feelings where we are either afraid of or we feel ashamed, even if this shame isn't ours necessarily, or like brought on us, or it's inherited or something like that, or we experience we didn't do necessarily something, but something is done to us. All those things. I feel like vulnerability makes it easier to access those things without necessarily really going to this heaviness forever, because you go into those emotions with vulnerability, and so you can grow from it and maybe transform anger into love, or fear into curiosity, or things like that. And I think all these transformation of these emotions are really depending on vulnerability towards yourself. And I think that is also this being true to yourself and know that you belong to yourself. And I think, do you know the content creator Lily Singh?
Yeah.
She has a great book, and she described there like she wants to be more than the obstacles that she had in her life. And I think that is also the same thing, like being really strong to kind of like grow out of the emotions that you got because something happened to you, and transform that to something that makes you grow. And at least that is the impression that I got from your blog, that that is a journey that I personally, in my perception, like that is of course like how I read it, like that this is the journey of this growth. And I thought that is very beautiful.
Yeah, I think self-love is like thrown around here and there, and like self-care too, like thrown around here and there, but really hard to actually implement into your life. And one time I was hanging out with a really close friend of mine, and we were talking about, I think I was in university, and I was just like having a really tough time, and I was like, I had so much anxiety. I was dealing with a lot of like self-hate and a lot of like personal stuff, and I think I like had a panic attack, and then I like went over to their house, and I just needed a place to like just like release and let go. And I just like hated feeling this way. Like I hated anxiety. I hated where my mental health was at. I hated that I had to like deal with it. And my friend Matt was like, he was telling me that like that, when that stuff is like knocking at your front door, you have to like welcome it in and like pour it some tea, and just sit with it and say like, just like sit there with it. And it was like absurd, but so good, because like that was like a huge turning point for me, because that was like a part of me that I can't just like get rid of. And so when he was saying like welcome it in and like sit down with it and like ask, like love yourself, like ask how it is. And I think just like depersonalizing that and like taking it out for myself and saying like, no, this is like come in and you know sit with me and give yourself some time, give yourself some space. That was like super powerful for me, because I just like hated that I just like had anxiety. I hated that I was dealing with whatever I was dealing with at that time. I guess like, do you have a similar experience of like, especially with something like a physical disability, um, something that's like physical and a part of your body and visible for other people? Like, did you have experience similar, like sometime growing up where you found some sort of like acceptance, or you found a different perspective of like self-love of like, this is me? Did you experience something like that?
Definitely. But I have to say also that I struggled with a lot of anxiety or like depressional phases throughout my life a lot. But I would say they were not only like because of my experience regarding my disability, they were like many other things along the way. But I think especially when it comes to that, when I was a child, I mean, I think like the first 12 or 14 years of my life, so I went to so many doctors and they had like so many prognoses. My disability was caused by damage that was caused after vaccine, the polio vaccine, and putting out there like, I know nowadays everything is different regarding the vaccines, but back then that special kind of like formula or recipe of that vaccine was in the 90s different, and it was forbidden soon after. Also, like I got, it was I think 3 months after. I think they forbid this formula, and then they changed it to the one that nowadays it has a different one. But when that happened, one of the side effects I got first was like a brain infection, and then later on, so it's called hemiparesis on the left side. It's basically that my complete left side is weaker and has like, for me, like in the all day life, it's kind of like a delay of everything. Like that's why I do, for example, boxing, because it's kind of like literally like provoking the fact that my left hand is slower than the right hand and everything else, and all those coordinations between the hands and the leg and so on. Or I did climbing, so on. So I tried to confront myself with the fears that I had, because I was so used to saying, oh, I can't do that because of this and that. That kind of transformed also to a habit of mine of saying, oh, I can't do it, in way different ways. And so when I was a teenager, they said like, oh, maybe with like 18 she might sit in a wheelchair, we don't know. So then they said like, okay, maybe not with 18, but maybe with 40 she either might need like big surgery or needs a wheelchair. I don't know. So at some point, to coming back to your question, there was like this point of acceptance that I said like, well, I accept that I don't know. I know that the prognoses, they changed during like in time. And so I know that it can come that way or it can come in a different way. Either way, like at least when it comes to my physical life and how I can use my body to like, use my body sounds weird, but like can do whatever I want, like sports or I just do it because I believe in self-fulfilling prophecies nowadays way more than I used to believe like a couple of years ago. And I believe if I would have stick to this like, oh no, I will end up in a wheelchair one day, or maybe I need big surgeries or gonna be sick very soon or whatever, then it would come that way in a way, because it is like this, also like the stress and the fear that gets to your body, I think, at some point. So at least in that way, I feel like at some point I said, like, maybe it will happen, but that's okay. And honestly, there's no recipe to it, and I cannot really tell you like what exactly happened to that moment. I think the most important part was to see when I was 18, okay, I'm not ending up in a wheelchair right now. I'm good. I can walk. I do sports and everything. And maybe thanks to the fact that I did that all my life. So I think when I kind of like the first prognosis was beaten in a way, then it felt easier to accept the way that this uncertainty and unknown.
Yeah, listening to you talk. Thank you for sharing, by the way.
Thanks for listening.
I feel like, especially with like doctors and medical things, like dealing with ambiguity and dealing with things that are out of your control. So in your case, like when people are making speculations of like when you're 5 years old, and people are making speculations of when you're 40, like that is like as ambiguous as you can get and as out of control as you can get. You know, you have zero control over any of that, and you are only left with like wondering, you know, when I'm 18, like how will it be? When I'm 40, like how, like dealing with ambiguity and being so out of control like that is like extremely difficult. And I think the mindset, and also the fact that you just like you went and did things, you know, like you decided like I'm gonna climb, I'm gonna box, like, you know, despite all of that, I think that's like also like very strong and courageous. Like dealing with ambiguity is like very courageous, and I think that's really cool.
Thank you.
But yeah, again, like ambiguity is so hard to deal with sometimes, you know.
Can you explain that? Because I have to admit that I didn't know the term before. Like when you wrote about it, like I read it, but I haven't heard about this term before.
So yeah, like when things are ambiguous, it's just like, you know, it's not, there's no definitive, it's not for sure. It's not black or white. It's not one way or the other. And so like when things are out of your control, everything is ambiguous. You have no idea what's going to happen. You have no idea where you're at. And so you sort of have to bite the bullet, so to speak, and you have to like decide to like, I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this. And so like when you are in gym class and your class is swimming and they say, you know, Elisha, come and join us. And you're like, I'm not going to do it. Like I have this, I'm the integrated program or whatever. Like internally you have the fear of like, I'm going to fail, or you don't know what's going to happen. So you either sit there and you're scared of, you know, this might happen. Like, what if this happens? Like, what if I fail? What if this happens? Or you're like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to choose courage and I'm going to go and do something. I'm going to go swim. I'm going to do this. It like takes some serious like mental strength or wherewithal to not be consumed by fear in the time of ambiguity, you know. And so yeah, like choosing courage in the face of ambiguity is really hard. So
you mentioned it also in the combination of like identity, this word. Ambiguity. Oh my God! Sorry.
Ambiguity.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not the native here.
English is like your third language, okay?
So, in that combination with identity, like because like in the way like you explained it, it's like if something is out of your control, like it's outside of you or something outside of your own self is controlling it. So what does it mean to be ambiguous and a way of like in the term of like identity?
Yeah, I think personally for me, like, well, first, identity ambiguity is just where like your identity or knowing who you are, it's ambiguous. So you're not exactly sure, like, are these my values? Like, are these things I enjoy? Is this something that how I would identify myself as? Like, I'm not sure, like, or I don't know. And so for me personally, growing up, I had so much identity ambiguity because, like, I was a Korean person, an Asian person, but my family was white. My community was white. Everywhere I go, everyone was white. And so I was like, I'm part of white culture, like, but obviously I'm not white, um, you know. And so there wasn't a definitive spot there. So it was so ambiguous of like, am I an Asian person? Am I a white person? I'm not sure. Like race was just like really hard for me to think about as a kid. And so that left me sort of like in a weird, like liminal space, in a weird in between. And so like, sort of like in your story, I guess too, like when you're placed in this integrated program, but you don't really want to be, or other people are saying all these things about you, but you're not sure, like, is this truly, is this who I am? Is this what I want? Is this who I'd like to be? And so I think when you're talking about belonging, I think having that like dissonance, having the internal argument of like who am I? It's nearly impossible for you to belong anywhere or to find a place to belong, because like you don't belong to yourself, and you don't know where you will best belong. And so I just think having opportunities where you can say like, this is something I care about, or like, I don't know what's going to happen to me in 5 years or whatever, but like I'm going to choose right now to go and do this, to go and do this activity that I was scared to do, or I'm going to I don't know, I'm going to reach out to somebody who like I wasn't sure where we stood, but I'm going to choose courage, and I'm going to be vulnerable with this person. I just think that it's sort of like paralyzing when you don't know exactly who you are or where you stand with those kinds of things.
We kind of come back to the thing of like, okay, focusing on yourself, but having also the support of others and your surrounding. Where does it start? Or is it like the question of the chicken and the egg or something? Like, do you, because I feel when it is like, okay, feeling acceptance also in a surrounding and belonging there helps you to find the calmness to accept yourself. And also like sometimes it is, if we don't feel accepted by others, that we turn into this like, oh, I'm not good enough, or we get this like feelings of like, I'm weird. It is like really like this sometimes imposter syndrome of like being a wrong space, being just not fitting in, because you experience not fitting in so many times. So how is it possible to like break the cycle? Is it really like just starting with yourself and belonging, or with like accepting and self-belonging, or is it turning towards the people that actually give you the feeling of belonging to their love, or like they share the love with you?
Yeah, there's definitely a chicken and the egg sort of idea with it. But I also like, that's one of the things that I really love about talking about this, is that like everybody has to buy in to what belonging is, because in order for me to accept myself, I have to like turn inward, and for other people to accept me, like they also have to turn inward and then that's also reflected onto me. And so like everyone kind of is buying into it at the same time. And I also think that I don't know, like sometimes it's definitely hard to choose to be kind to someone who maybe triggers like some fear or anger in us of like I don't know if they're gonna like me, I don't know if I'm gonna like them, but like again, like that's kind of like an ambiguous thing of like you still have to choose to do something. So are you gonna be kind, or are you gonna reject them? And I think with that
so
too,
true.
right? And I think with that too, like call it rejection or othering, or I think like bottom line is like when people are telling you that like you don't belong, like that's also like inside yourself too. So like self-fulfilling prophecy or imposter syndrome, where you're like this I shouldn't be doing this, or I don't deserve to be here. Like you're already counting yourself out because like you're telling yourself that like you don't belong. But I think in most cases, like you really belong like wherever you want to, I guess you could say. And that's obviously nuanced. Like you can't go anywhere and just say like I deserve to be here. Like that's not it. That's not it. But getting to the conversation of like where does that, how do you overcome not belonging? How do you overcome like maybe fear or rejection or loneliness, and like creating that sort of shift? I think I feel like I constantly think about that because like selfishly it would be possible to like turn that into like a workplace workshop or working in schools or something like that. But I think too, like it's like maybe the most important, but I guess like also sort of like the most difficult to like think about and talk about of like how do we create places where we belong? How do we create spaces where everyone feels like they belong somewhere? And especially because it's like what you've said, like there's not a formula, there's not a like recipe to like just do this in a day. Like it takes time and it takes like a lot of vulnerability and work, and so it is like sort of super elusive of like how do we actually create this in our own lives. So yeah.
And you said something super important, which I think is so essential there, and that is like triggers. You mentioned triggers because especially as someone who experienced being left out or feeling this like urge of like I want to belong so badly, but then we can be also in the spot of like someone else wants to belong to us, or we are kind of like a bridge between a social group and one person or whatever, and we have the power to kind of invite them into the setting and be kind and all those things. And as you said, like it's super important to think about like, so how can we create the safe space for someone to be someone where someone feels okay, I can turn to them and I can feel understood, I will be listened to, I will not be rejected. And I felt sometimes like I definitely want to be that space, but it's also like this feeling of like being responsible for the person that feels this not belonging, so that I could overdo it, or get sometimes into like a parental state of like, okay, I'm trying to support them right now with everything so they don't feel rejected, and overdo it. When it comes to like giving that to others, like outside of your own personal life, it's sometimes easier. For example, I lived abroad in Sweden for a while, and for a few months, I worked in a community center, and they did like very interesting things or events where teenagers could come and talk about, for example, what they want to be when they are older, what kind of interests do they have, and creating the space of like, here you can come and talk about your wishes, your values, your dreams. Sometimes it is easier, at least for me, maybe I have to speak for myself, it's easier for me to create a setting where people feel welcomed, which has nothing to do with me, because I feel sometimes I'm triggered easily in this, like, and I think about my own fears then more, if it's more personal. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. And I think too that like sometimes in like personal stuff too, like especially if that's close to like things that happened in childhood or family, sometimes those things hit so much harder because it was so like close to you as a kid, or like with family, of course, like your parents are, it's like the most intimate relationship that you have. And so when you find those moments or find people that press those specific buttons that trigger you, that like it like raises your fight or flight or anxiety or whatever, of like, like this thing's gonna happen again or whatever, like I think that is the hardest to work through because it's the most vulnerable, it's the deepest for you. So I think that definitely makes sense.
So it really comes to, again, to the vulnerability, like, or the amount of vulnerability we put into making someone else feel like they belong, because it's also like about opening up. And I think creating spaces where we normalize talking about what do we need, what do we wish for, how can we support you achieving something that you want to achieve, and that are the spaces also that support you, I think, or support someone in achieving their own fullest potential, because then they are not afraid of the rejection, as open as it is. Like, you can be yourself, you can talk about the things you like, you can experiment different things, and we just want you to be happy, basically. I think that is what it comes down to.
I think I appreciate you talking about the time when you were working at that community center too, because regardless if it's with like teenagers or adults or children, like having that space, that third space, where you're saying like, if that's important to you, then that's important to me too. And so I think having that third space where people can come and express, hey, this is what's important to me, I want you to care about that. And then I think for you to be able to offer, like, I think that's important, and I also think that these things are important. I think having that sort of third space where people are free, like what you said, exactly what you said, like are free to express and are free to share without rejection or judgment, I think is like really, really important. But I also think that having a space like that has boundaries and is a safe place where you can come and say, hey, I think this is really important. And if other people don't think that, I think having the safety to still be and belong there when other people are saying, like, you maybe think that's important, but like, we don't think that, or maybe we think a little bit differently, but like, please still come and be a part of this group. I think that's like really important. And I think that's an interesting distinction right now too, because like with cancel culture and with so many different conflicting ideologies, it's so important to be able to exist in sort of a gray space and to have those boundaries to where you can say, like, I think differently, or this is important in a different way to me, but then to step in and say, tell me more about what you think, or tell me why you think that, and to further that conversation. Obviously, if something is like completely unacceptable or ethically or like humanely absolutely not acceptable, like it's important again to have a boundary to say like, no, like we can't say that, or we don't accept that, or that is othering someone else, or that is creating, that's like destroying the space that we've created for these other people. I think that's really important to establish that boundary. Yeah, and I think this is going back to what you were talking about with like, especially with like personal life things, like how you communicate that. Like communication is so important, and I think what you're talking about with like, these are things that other people care about, and these are things that you think is like interesting, and like we want you to like feel a certain way. I think first and foremost, like communication is like really important, and how are you communicating that? Are you like having conversations where you're like directly asking people like, hey, like how would you like me to talk about this, or how would you like me to how would you like to spend your time when you're here? You know, if it's something like a community center or a school, like how would you like to spend your time? And it could also, your communication could also be like much more indirect, or like with your like body language, like communicating that is like so important. Which I know that's like extremely general, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
But sometimes it is a general aspect we need. Like it doesn't have to be always super specific and difficult. I mean, literally what you just said is like communication, trust, openness, but also, you know, and that is what I mentioned before with Brené Brown. She had this like 7 aspects of trust, and she calls it braving in like an acronym, and that is boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. No, was it generosity? Yeah, I think it was generosity. And like also like having the benefit of the doubt and so on. And like I think what you mentioned before, like having open communications about things where we do sometimes disagree and feel like, okay, I don't, like my opinion doesn't align with yours, but I'm still curious and I want to understand, because everything else is just driving us apart and is not like leading to an understanding of an us. And that is, for example, this whole approach or this whole meaning or like idea of this podcast, to understand different aspects, different narratives, different perspectives on an one or more topics, and having exchanges with people that are not in your own bubble, reality bubble in a way. Because within this bubble, we can find sometimes comfort and don't have to think about conflicting problems or social issues, but they are not really getting us closer if we all just live in our little shell. And yeah, that is why it was so interesting, like to reach, or it is interesting to reach out to people like you, because you have really important things to say and you're really an amazing mind. So I think it is so enriching, like what you have to say. So I'm just happy to know that a person with the mindset that you have is in the social field and connecting people in so many different ways. And just thank you for your vocation and your approach on social issues. And
thank you. I mean, it's not like a service or anything. Thank you.
I know that this is something very American, like thank you for your service, but we don't have that. No, I just appreciate like you sharing. You know, that is how many people are not doing it.
Yeah, and I don't know. Likewise, like I think again, like getting back to like the cheesy thing, like it's way better to put something like this in the world than something that's negative or toxic. And so So yeah, thank you too for participating in this, with me. And I do hope that I have more of a structured time to write, I guess. And maybe with this new job too, I'll have more things to write about. I think it'll put me in a better headspace for it. So yeah.
Sounds amazing. This was the very first episode of the Dissonance Makes Sense podcast, held in a dialogue with Karl Johnson, social worker and founder of the blog Belonging, talking about the very same topic. For me personally, this was an incredible experience to try out content creation, technical setup and structure, and how to get in touch with someone who literally lives on the other side of the planet. But that reflects on what the vision is for this podcast. Talking about societal challenges, social issues, and interpersonal development. And maybe taking a step out of my own believed reality. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and I thank you very much for listening. See you soon. Bye!